The morning Ada Finley discovered she had been dead in the eyes of the law for 3 years was the same morning a stranger rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with a sealed document tucked inside his saddlebag that would change everything she thought she knew about her own life. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat near the southern border of Kansas like a wound that had never quite healed, a cattle town built on dust and ambition, and the kind of desperation that made men do terrible things to one another. The streets were wide enough to turn a full cattle drive, and the saloons never closed, and the sheriff spent more time collecting bribes than collecting criminals. Ada knew all of this because she had lived here her whole life, 23 years of breathing Caldwell's gritty air and learning its rhythms the way you learn the habits of a difficult animal. She worked at the Calloway boarding house, the respectable establishment on the eastern end of Meridian Street, the one that catered to traveling merchants and passing cattle buyers rather than to cowboys looking for trouble. She washed linens and cooked breakfast and kept the ledger when Mrs. Calloway's eyes were too tired for the numbers. She had been doing this since she was 16, since her mother had died of fever and left her with nothing but a small trunk of clothes and the address of a distant relation who had never answered her letter. Ada was not a woman who spent much time feeling sorry for herself. She was practical in the way that poverty teaches you to be practical, and she was sharp in the way that loneliness teaches you to be sharp. She had dark brown hair that she kept braided and pinned under a kerchief when she worked, and eyes the color of creek water after rain, somewhere between green and gray, and impossible to name exactly. She was not beautiful in the way the saloon girls were beautiful, bright and deliberate and dressed for it, but she had a quality to her face that made people look twice, something honest in the line of her jaw and the directness of her gaze that was harder to manufacture than prettiness. She was carrying a basket of clean sheets down the back stairs when she heard her name spoken in a voice she did not recognize. It was a man's voice, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had learned long ago that raising it rarely improved matters. She paused on the stairs and listened. "Ada Finley," the voice said again, speaking to Mrs. Calloway. By the sound of it, the older woman's responses coming in the fluttering, nervous register she used when she was trying to seem important. "I have business regarding her. Legal business. I'd be grateful if you'd point me in her direction." Ada set the basket down on the step and descended the rest of the stairs deliberately, not rushing, not hiding, because neither rushing nor hiding had ever served her particularly well. She rounded the corner into the front parlor and found Mrs. Calloway standing near the entrance with her hands clasped together and her face arranged in an expression of carefully managed alarm. The man standing across from her was tall, though not so tall as to make a production of it. He wore a trail-dusty coat the color of tobacco, and his hat was pushed back just enough to show a face that was weathered without being coarsened, the face of a man in his late 20s who had spent most of those years outdoors. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something unforgiving, and brown eyes that were calm and watchful, and he held his hat in his hands with the brim turned between his fingers in a slow, steady rotation, the only indication he was not entirely at ease. He looked at Ada when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly, but she felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. "Ada Finley," he said, and it was not a question this time. "That's right," she said. "Who are you?" "Silas Fairchild," he said. "I've ridden from Dodge City. I need to speak with you privately if you're willing. It concerns your father's estate." Ada went still. Her father, Harlan Finley, had died 8 months ago. She had received word by letter, the letter delivered by a passing rider who had taken it from the Dodge City postal clerk. She had not gone to the funeral. She had not been told there was one until after it had already happened. She and her father had not been on speaking terms for 6 years, not since he had left Caldwell with a woman named Dorothea Marsh and settled somewhere in the cattle country west of Dodge, not since he had written her precisely 2 letters in all that time, both of them asking for money she did not have. She had not thought much about his estate, because Harlan Finley had not been the kind of man who accumulated things worth inheriting. She had not thought there would be papers, legal papers, papers with her name on them. She looked at Silas Fairchild for a moment, measuring him the way you measure a piece of ground before you step onto it. "All right," she said. "We can speak in the dining room. Mrs. Calloway, I'll only be a moment." Mrs. Calloway made a sound that was equal parts curiosity and reluctant compliance, and Ada led Silas Fairchild through the door on the left and into the long dining room with its smell of coffee and bacon grease and the lingering warmth of the morning meal. She sat down at the near end of the table. He sat across from her and set his hat on the wood beside him and reached inside his coat for a document that was folded into thirds and sealed with a red wax impression she did not recognize. He did not hand it to her. He held it on the table between them, and she noticed that his jaw had tightened slightly, that the calmness of his expression was now doing more work than it had been a moment ago. "Miss Finley," he said, "I'm going to tell you something before I let you read this because I think you deserve to hear it plain rather than discover it cold on the page." "Go ahead," she said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "I'm an attorney's clerk," he said. "I work for a firm in Dodge City, Barton and Webb. My employer, Mr. Barton, drafted this document. It's your father's will. He filed it with the county clerk in Ford County 6 months before he died." He paused and his fingers pressed flat against the paper. "Your name appears in it." "I would expect it to," Ada said carefully. "Not the way you'd expect," Silas said, and the words came out with a quiet heaviness that made her fingers go cold. "Miss Finley, your father listed you as property. Specifically, he listed you as a debt instrument. He owed a man named Cutter Payne approximately $800, borrowed over 2 years for cattle speculation that failed. The will states that this debt is to be satisfied by your indenture, your labor, for a period of not less than 5 years in service to Payne and his operation. It gives Payne legal authority to claim that service." He stopped. "It uses the word ownership in one section. I want you to know that." The dining room was very quiet. Ada could hear the clock on the wall, a dry, insistent ticking, and the distant sound of a horse on the street outside, and the blood in her own ears. She looked at the document on the table. "My father," she said slowly, "listed me in his will as a means of paying a debt." "Yes," Silas said, "without my knowledge. Yes. Without my consent. Yes. And this is a legal document filed with the county." "It is," Silas said. "But Miss Finley, I need you to understand why I'm here and not Cutter Payne. I'm here because Mr. Barton asked me to deliver this and have you sign an acknowledgement of receipt, which would begin the legal clock on your service obligation. Payne has a copy of the will. He knows you're in Caldwell. He intends to come here himself, possibly within the week, to enforce what your father wrote." He looked at her steadily. "I read this document on the ride here, all of it. I want you to read it too." He pushed it across the table to her. Ada's hands were not entirely steady as she unfolded it, but they were steadier than she would have expected. She read it in full, and it took her some time because the legal language was dense and deliberate, and because she read it twice to make sure she was understanding it correctly. The second time through, a cold and clarifying anger settled over her, the kind of anger that does not shout or break things but instead becomes very, very focused. Her father had not left her money. He had not left her his horse or his rifle or the land he had homesteaded near Spearville, which it turned out he had already sold off to settle earlier debts. He had left her specifically and by name Ada Finley, his daughter, as payment, as a thing to be transferred, as a line in a ledger. She set the document down very precisely on the table in front of her. "Mr. Fairchild," she said. "Yes. What would happen if I simply refused to sign your acknowledgement of receipt?" "Payne could still enforce it," Silas said. "The will is already filed. Your signature on the acknowledgement just establishes that you were formally notified. Without it, he'd have to notify you through the court, but that's a matter of weeks, not prevention. And if I left Caldwell, He could have the court compel your return, theoretically. In practice, it would depend on how much effort he was willing to put into it and whether the local law cooperated. His voice was flat, informational, but she could see something working behind his eyes. Miss Finley, I have to be honest with you. I don't know how much force Cutter Payne would use. He's a hard man. He has reach in Ford County. But I also don't know that what this document describes is actually legal under Kansas statutes. The 13th Amendment abolished involuntary servitude in 1865. A will cannot legally bind a free person to labor, regardless of a family member's debt. What your father wrote is, in my opinion, not enforceable. But that opinion has to be argued before a judge, and in the meantime, Payne could make your life very difficult. Ada looked at him. She had been spoken to plainly by very few people in her life, and she was unused to it in a way that made it almost physically striking, like stepping from a dark room into sunlight. You know it's not legal, she said. I believe it's not legal, he corrected carefully. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a clerk. But I've read enough to know what the law says, and I know that what this document attempts is deeply wrong, not just unlawful, wrong. She studied his face for a moment. He held her gaze without flinching and without performing anything, no sympathy he did not feel, no reassurance he could not back up. You rode 3 days from Dodge City to deliver this, she said. Yes. And you did not have to tell me any of what you just told me. You could have simply asked me to sign the acknowledgement. No, he said quietly. I couldn't have done that, not after I read it. There was a silence between them that was different from the silence that had preceded it. Ada folded her hands on the table and looked at the document, and then she looked at Silas Fairchild, and she made a decision. What would you suggest I do? She asked. He had clearly been thinking about this for some time because he did not hesitate. First, I'd suggest you do not sign my acknowledgement. Second, I'd suggest you let me take this to a judge. There's a circuit judge who passes through Wichita every month, a man named Aldrin Foster, who has a reputation for ruling according to the law and not according to who has money. Third, I'd suggest you don't go anywhere alone until Payne has been dealt with legally, because the law is one thing and Cutter Payne is another thing, and they don't always move at the same speed. Ada looked at the document one more time. Then she picked it up from the table, stood, and walked to the small cast-iron stove in the corner of the dining room where the breakfast fire had died down to embers. She opened the grate. Miss Finley, Silas said, his voice sharpening slightly as he rose from his chair. I want you to burn it, she said, and she turned and held the document out to him. Not me. You read it and you know what it says, and I want you to be the one to do it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. Something that was not surprise exactly but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who had prepared himself for several possibilities and found that the actual event surpassed all of them. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took the document from her hand. He looked at it once, the sealed and witnessed and formally filed declaration that Ada Finley was a debt, and then he opened the grate of the stove and pushed it into the embers. The paper caught quickly, curling and darkening, and they both stood and watched it burn until there was nothing left but ash and the smell of scorched wax. Silas closed the grate and stepped back. He looked at Ada. She was watching the stove with an expression that was part devastation and part fierce, clean relief, and he thought in that moment that he had never seen anything quite so honest on a human face in his life. Thank you, she said without looking at him. There's still pain, he said. I know, she said, but now there's also you. He did not know what to say to that, which was unusual for him, so he said nothing at all, and stood beside her in the quiet dining room while the embers ticked and settled, and outside, Caldwell went about its morning business, wholly unaware that something significant had just happened inside the Calloway boarding house. Silas Fairchild had not intended to stay in Caldwell. He had intended to deliver the document, return to Dodge City, and continue his employment with Barton and Webb until he had saved enough money to open a small law office of his own. which had been his plan since he was 19 years old, and had first discovered that the law, properly applied, was one of the few reliable tools a man without money or family connections could use to affect the world around him. He had grown up in the dust of Abilene before the cattle trade moved south, the son of a saddle maker who had worked himself into an early grave, and he had educated himself through the public library and through the generosity of a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Hartley, who had recognized something in him and lent him books she ordered specially from the East. He had gotten himself hired as a clerk for Barton and Webb at 21, by demonstrating that he could draft a cleaner contract in half the time of their previous clerk, and he had spent 4 years reading everything the firm's library contained and attending every court proceeding he could get into. He was 28 years old, and he was not a man given to impulsive decisions, which is why he surprised himself considerably when he went to the livery stable after leaving the boarding house and arranged for his horse to be kept for an extended period rather than just overnight. He told himself it was practical. He told himself he needed to be here in Caldwell to help manage the legal situation with Cutter Payne. He told himself that leaving now would be irresponsible given what he had set in motion by burning that document. All of this was true, and none of it was the whole truth, but Silas Fairchild had a habit of being thorough, and he was not yet ready to examine the rest of it. He took a room at the Caldwell Hotel, which was less reputable than the Callaway boarding house, but had the advantage of being across the street from it, and in the late afternoon he went back to speak with Ada. She was in the kitchen garden behind the boarding house, turning the soil in a bed of early spring vegetables, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her braid come half loose, and her expression one of concentrated attention that had nothing to do with radishes. She had been thinking hard since the morning. He could see it in the set of her shoulders. She looked up when she heard him and straightened and pushed a loose strand of hair back from her face. "You stayed," she said. "I thought it best," he said, and then, because he had never been comfortable with less than the truth, he added, "I also didn't feel right about leaving." She considered this. "I need to think about what comes next," she said. "Payne will come looking eventually. If there's no document here for him to point to, what does he have?" "His copy of the will," Silas said. "The county filing. The original is still in the clerk's records in Dodge City. Burning my copy was symbolic and important, but it doesn't erase the filed document. So we need to attack the filing itself," Ada said. He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "All morning," she said. "You said it isn't legal under the 13th Amendment. Can we get a lawyer to argue that before a judge?" "We need the circuit judge," he said. "Foster. He'll be in Wichita in about 3 weeks. In the meantime, I can draft a legal challenge and get it into his hands before his session begins. But Miss Finley, I need to ask you something." He paused. "Do you have any money at all? Hiring a lawyer costs, and while I can draft the documents, I can't appear before the judge myself." Ada was quiet for a moment, and he saw the familiar shadow of a person calculating what they had against what they needed and finding the numbers do not match. He recognized it because he had lived in that shadow himself for a long time. "I have $42 saved," she said. "Every cent of it." "That may be enough to retain someone for a single hearing," he said. "I know a man in Wichita, a lawyer named Perry Aldgate, who takes cases on conscience sometimes. I can write to him." Ada nodded once, the decisive nod of someone who had made peace with a difficult situation and was now ready to move through it. "Then we should do all of that," she said. "And Mr. Fairchild, you should know that if Payne comes here before the hearing, I'm not going anywhere with him." "No," Silas said, and there was something in his voice that was more than professional. "You're not." She looked at him again in that steady way of hers, and he had the feeling of being read accurately and thoroughly, the feeling he usually associated with unease but which, in this instance, produced something else entirely. "Come in," she said. "Mrs. Callaway makes a good supper, and I expect she'll let you sit at the table if I ask. We can talk about the letter to your lawyer friend." He followed her inside, stooping slightly through the kitchen door, and Mrs. Calloway looked at him with the evaluating expression of a woman who runs a respectable establishment and must make quick determinations about the respectability of those who enter it. Whatever she saw in Silas Fairchild apparently satisfied her, because she ladled him a bowl of beef stew without being asked and told him to sit down. They spent the evening at the dining table with paper and ink, and Silas drafted the letter to Perry Aldgate while Ada looked over his shoulder and occasionally said things like, "That's too formal, say it plainer," or, "Can you add that part about the 13th Amendment again? I want him to see it clearly." And Silas found himself adjusting the language according to her suggestions, and discovering that every single adjustment she proposed was an improvement. "You write well yourself," he said after the fourth such revision. "I read a great deal," she said. "There isn't much else to do in the evenings here." "What do you read?" She paused, as though the question were unexpected, which it probably was. People did not often ask Ada Finley what she read. "History mostly, some law when I can find it. I borrowed a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries from a traveling merchant last year and kept it for 2 months." She smiled slightly, a small, precise smile. He was very annoyed about that. Silas looked at her and felt something that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, and was in fact both of those things together with something additional he could not name. "I have 3 law books in my saddlebag," he said. "You can borrow any of them." The smile changed slightly. It became warmer and less carefully managed, and he thought it was one of the better things he had seen in recent memory. The letter to Perry Aldgate went out with the morning mail rider the next day, and then there was nothing to do but wait and go about ordinary life, which proved more complicated than it sounded. Silas stayed. He did not have a good reason to leave, and he had several reasons to stay, and he told himself that the primary one was the legal situation with Cutter Payne. This was at least partially true. He spent his days in his hotel room drafting supporting documents, writing out his own summary of the relevant Kansas statutes regarding involuntary servitude, and doing the kind of careful, meticulous legal work that he had always found satisfying in the way that solving a difficult puzzle is satisfying. But he also found himself at the Calloway boarding house most mornings for breakfast and most evenings for supper, because Mrs. Calloway had decided he was respectable, and because Ada Finley was there, and being in the same room as Ada Finley had become, in the space of 3 days, something he thought about before he thought about most other things. He was not accustomed to this. He was a careful man by nature, methodical and self-contained, and his relationships with women had always been polite and somewhat distant, the distance of a person who is concentrating on something else and knows it. He had never been in love, or if he had not recognized it as such, had attributed it to admiration or friendship or the pleasant feeling of shared interest, and moved efficiently past it. This did not feel like something he could move efficiently past. Ada was not what he had expected, though he was not sure what he had expected. She was direct and quick-minded and occasionally wry in a way that caught him off guard. She was self-sufficient to a degree that occasionally frustrated him, because it meant she would not ask for help unless she had already exhausted every alternative. She had opinions about things and was not shy about stating them, and she was right about them with an irritating frequency. On the 4th evening, they sat on the back porch of the boarding house in the last light of the day, and Ada asked him why he had become a lawyer's clerk. He told her about Abilene and the saddle-maker father and Mrs. Hartley and the library, and she listened the way she did everything, with complete and focused attention, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. "You want to be a lawyer yourself," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "I have enough saved to sit the bar examination in Topeka. I've been putting it off." "Why?" He considered this. "Fear, partly. If I take the examination and fail, I have to reckon with what that means. If I never take it, I can continue believing I would have passed." Ada turned to look at him with an expression of such direct assessment that it was almost uncomfortable. "You would pass," she said flatly. You know it better than anyone I've spoken to, and I've spoken to 2 actual lawyers. Stop putting it off." He looked at her. "You've known me for days." "I know enough," she said, and looked back at the darkening sky. They sat in the quiet for a while, and Silas was aware of the warmth of her presence beside him in the cooling evening air, and the smell of the garden and the distant sound of Caldwell's saloons beginning their nightly business, and the particular stillness that settles over a moment that is not entirely ordinary. "Ada," he said, and she looked at him again, "are you frightened? About pain?" She thought about it honestly, which was what she always did, rather than giving the automatic reassurance or the automatic admission that people typically offered. "Yes," she said, "not of him exactly. I'm frightened of being made into something I'm not, of having someone else's story about me be treated as more real than my own." "It won't be," he said, and the conviction in his voice was such that she looked at him sharply. "You can't promise that." "No," he said, "but I can promise that I won't let it happen without a fight, and I intend to fight hard." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away, and he thought he saw something shift in her expression, something soft and careful and not entirely defended against. He did not push it. He sat beside her in the dusk and was patient, which was another of his more reliable qualities. The reply from Perry Aldgate came 8 days after they sent the letter, and it was better than Silas had hoped for. Aldgate wrote that he had reviewed the statutes Silas had cited and agreed that the provision in the will was constitutionally unenforceable under the 13th Amendment's prohibition of involuntary servitude, and that furthermore, the will's characterization of a living person as property was a legal absurdity that no Kansas court should sustain. He agreed to argue the case before Judge Foster in Wichita for the sum of $30, which he said he was charging only because he needed to pay his associates' travel costs, and not because he thought Ada owed him anything. Ada read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down and said, "He sounds like a decent man." "He is," Silas said. "One of the few." "Then we go to Wichita," she said. "We go to Wichita," Silas confirmed, and tried not to think too much about the fact that saying we had come easily and without self-consciousness from both of them. It was 2 days later, however, that Cutter Payne arrived in Caldwell, and he arrived before they had managed to leave. Ada was in the front parlor of the boarding house mending a curtain when she heard the horses outside, and something in the sound of them, the number and the authority of the pace, made her set the curtain down and stand up. She went to the window and looked out. There were 3 men. The one in the middle was heavy-set and prosperous-looking in a stiff way, wearing a good coat and a hat with a silver band, and his horse was a large bay that he handled with casual expertise. This was Cutter Payne. She knew it without being told, the way you know a threat by the way it moves before you have identified it precisely. The 2 men flanking him were employees of a specific type, the type that Cutter Payne's money rented in saloons and cattle yards, lean and watchful and carrying themselves with the particular confidence of men who had decided long ago that other people's discomfort was not their problem. Silas was not in the boarding house. He had gone to the telegraph office. Ada stood at the window and thought very quickly about her options, and then she went to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch before any of them could knock. Payne looked at her from horseback and she looked back at him, and the street between them felt wider than it actually was. "You're Ada Finley," Payne said. "I am," she said. "I'm Cutter Payne. I expect you know why I'm here." "I do," she said. "And I expect you know that what you're here for isn't legal." Something shifted in Payne's expression, the particular shift of a man who is accustomed to having his authority assumed and who has encountered, unexpectedly, a person who is not assuming it. "Your father left a legal document," he said, "filed proper with the county court. You've got a debt to settle, girl." "I'm not a girl," Ada said, and her voice was very steady. "And I don't have a debt. My father had a debt. My father is dead." A dead man cannot transfer the freedom of a living woman to satisfy his obligations. That's the law. I have a lawyer in Wichita who will explain it to a judge, and I expect the judge will agree. Payne's jaw tightened. You've been talking to someone. I've been reading, Ada said, which I've always done. Mr. Payne, I'd encourage you to speak to a lawyer of your own before you take any action here that would embarrass you in a courtroom. What I'm going to take, Payne said, his voice dropping to something colder and flatter, is what your father promised me. Legal document says I can. It doesn't, said a voice from the left, and Ada felt a loosening of something tight in her chest as Silas came around the corner of the building with his long-legged, unhurried walk, his coat pushed back and his hands visible, and his expression carrying the particular calm of a man who has decided that the situation requires steadiness rather than aggression. Payne looked at him. "Who are you?" "Silas Fairchild," Silas said, stepping up onto the porch to stand beside Ada. He did not touch her, but she felt the warmth of his presence at her shoulder like something solid. "I'm a law clerk employed by Barton and Webb in Dodge City, the same firm that drafted the document you're referring to. I've reviewed the relevant statutes, and I can tell you plainly that what Ada Finley wrote does not constitute a legally enforceable obligation under Kansas law or federal constitutional law. The 13th Amendment, ratified 17 years ago, prohibits involuntary servitude. A will cannot impose it. If you attempt to compel Miss Finley to leave with you, you will be committing a criminal act regardless of what any county filing says." Payne was quiet for a moment. He looked at Silas with the calculating expression of a man who is determining whether the obstacle in front of him is real or performative. He appeared to arrive at a conclusion that it was real. "You burned my document," Payne said, looking now at Ada. "A copy was burned," Ada said evenly. "The filed record in Ford County still exists, and so does our challenge to it. We have a hearing date with Judge Foster in Wichita." This was a small embellishment of the truth, since the hearing date had not yet been formally set, but Ada delivered it with such precision that it sounded like established fact, and Silas did not contradict it. Payne looked between them for a long moment. Then he looked at Ada with an expression that was frankly threatening, not theatrical threatening, but the quiet, certain kind that is more serious than the theatrical kind. "This isn't over," he said. "When the judge rules, it will be," Silas said. Payne turned his horse and his two companions turned with him, and they rode back down Meridian Street without looking back. Ada watched until they were out of sight and then let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. "You came back at the right moment," she said. "I heard the horses from a block away," Silas said. "I walked faster." She turned and looked at him, and he was closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the afternoon light, which was brown with something amber at the center, and she was suddenly and acutely aware of how near he was standing and of the fact that she did not want him to step back. "We should leave for Wichita soon," she said, her voice somewhat less steady than it had been on the porch. "Tomorrow morning," he said, and he had not stepped back. "I'll arrange horses." "I can ride," she said. "I know you can," he said, and there was a warmth in the words that had nothing to do with literal meaning, and they stood on the porch of the Calloway boarding house in the Caldwell afternoon, and the moment was not entirely about horses or Wichita or Cutter Payne. Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway behind them and broke it with characteristic practicality. "Well," she said, "if you're leaving tomorrow, you'd better eat something tonight, both of you, because I'm not sending you on the road hungry." They ate. And it was the best meal Ada could remember in recent years, not because of what Mrs. Calloway cooked, though the roast chicken was excellent, but because of the conversation that accompanied it, easy and ranging and occasionally funny, and because of the way Silas looked at her across the table in the lamplight with an expression that was open in a way she suspected was unusual for him. They left Caldwell the next morning before the town was fully awake, with their horses packed, and the cool spring air carrying the smell of grass and distant rain, and they rode north toward Wichita on the road that followed the line of the creek. Kansas in the spring of 1882 was extraordinary in the way that Plains country is extraordinary, vast and luminous, the sky so large it seemed to have its own weather independent of the earth below it. Ada had not been out of Caldwell in 2 years, and she had forgotten the particular freedom of open country, the way the horizon goes back and back and back, until it seems to contain everything and nothing in equal measure. They rode mostly in comfortable silence the first morning, the kind of silence that does not need filling. Silas rode a sorrel horse named Fletcher who had strong opinions about the pace, and Ada rode a brown mare she had borrowed from Mrs. Calloway's cousin, a steady and sensible animal she called Brownie for lack of better inspiration. Around mid-morning, when they had settled into a rhythm, Silas said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Ada said. "Your father, did you love him?" It was the kind of question that most people in the interests of social comfort would not ask. Ada appreciated the absence of that particular kind of caution in him. "I did," she said, after thinking about it. "When I was young, I thought he was remarkable. He could tell a story better than anyone I knew. He had a laugh that filled the room. But he was also a man who could not stay put, could not settle to anything, and every few years he would start over somewhere new and leave whatever he'd built behind him. My mother spent her whole life managing the damage from his restlessness." She paused. "After she died, he left within 6 months. I don't think he could stand being somewhere that reminded him of her, but he left me behind too." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was not the reflexive sorry of social convention but the actual kind, weighted with understanding. "What I find hardest," Ada said, "isn't that he didn't love me. I think he did in his way. What I find hardest is that he could write my name into a document like that and believe he was doing something that made sense, that he had the kind of relationship to me in his own mind where that was a coherent thought." "It says something about him," Silas said. "Nothing about you." "I know that," Ada said. "Now, it took me the better part of yesterday to know it." He looked at her, and she looked back, and the horses walked on through the spring grass, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence at all. They stopped for the midday meal beside the creek where it widened into a series of shallow pools, and Ada spread a cloth on the bank and set out the provisions Mrs. Calloway had packed: cold biscuits and dried beef and 2 hard-boiled eggs, and a jar of preserved plum jam that seemed extravagantly cheerful for the circumstances. They ate with their boots off and their feet near the water, which was cold and clear and smelled like clean stone. "Tell me about Wichita," Ada said. "I've never been." "It's changed," Silas said. "It was a cattle town like Caldwell 5 or 6 years ago. Now it's trying to be something more settled. There are brick buildings going up, more churches." Cattle drives moved south after they fenced the farms. He dipped a biscuit in the jam. "Judge Foster holds his sessions in a proper courthouse building. It's smaller than it sounds, but it's a real court." "Have you been in court often?" Ada asked. "Many times," he said, "but always as a clerk, carrying documents, taking notes, sitting behind the lawyer and handing him things." He smiled faintly. "I know what it looks like from every angle except the one I want." "The bar examination," Ada said. "Yes. When does it next take place?" "June," he said, "in Topeka." "That's 6 weeks from now," she said. "You should go." He looked at her. "I'm aware of the date." "Then go," she said simply. "What's keeping you?" He held her gaze for a moment, and she had the sudden, clear sense that what he was about to say was true and that it would change the texture of things between them, and she felt the precise flutter of someone standing at a threshold. "You partly," he said quietly. "I didn't want to leave before this was resolved." Ada was quiet. The creek made its small musical sounds beside them, and somewhere upstream a bird was calling in short, repeated intervals. "And after it's resolved," she said carefully. "I don't know where I'll be," he said. "I hadn't planned past the hearing, but I've been thinking about it more in the last several days than I have in a long time." She looked at the water. "So have I," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not even close to one. But it was an acknowledgment, mutually arrived at and mutually understood, and it sat between them on the creek bank in the noon light with the weight and the warmth of something real. They arrived in Wichita 2 days later, in the early afternoon of a Thursday. the streets busy with the particular mix of commerce and chaos that characterized a plains town in transition. The cattle smell was still there, layered under the newer smell of sawdust and fresh mortar, and the hotels were full of men who looked like they had come to either make money or spend it, and were not entirely sure which had happened. Perry Aldgate's office was on Douglas Avenue, above a dry goods store, accessible by an exterior staircase that announced itself with a creaking authority that probably served as an adequate substitute for a doorbell. He was a small man in his 50s with a neat gray beard and the slightly apologetic manner of someone who has seen enough injustice to be genuinely embarrassed by it. He shook Ada's hand first, which told her something useful about him. "I've sent word to Judge Foster's clerk," he said when they had settled in his office, which was smaller than Ada had expected but organized with an almost passionate thoroughness. "The hearing is set for Monday. 4 days." He looked at Ada directly. "Miss Finley, I want to be straightforward with you. The law is on your side. What your father wrote is constitutionally indefensible. The argument I will make is simple and the precedent supporting it is clear. What I am less certain of is how Cutter Payne will respond to an adverse ruling. He is a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants through means that do not always involve the court." "I understand," Ada said. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay in Wichita?" She and Silas looked at each other briefly. They had not discussed this precisely. "I'll find a respectable boarding house," Ada said. "There's one on Emporia Street," Aldgate said. "The Widow Pierce runs it. I'll write you a note of introduction." He began to scratch it out immediately on a slip of paper. "Mr. Fairchild, you'll serve as a witness to the circumstances of the will's delivery. You were present at the document's handling and you have direct knowledge of its contents and the intent behind it." "Yes," Silas said. "I can testify to all of it." "Good." Aldgate folded the note for Ada and handed it across. "Then we are as prepared as we need to be. Come to me Saturday morning and we'll review the specifics." They descended the creaking staircase into the Wichita afternoon, and Ada stopped on the boardwalk and looked up and down Douglas Avenue with an expression of someone taking stock. 4 days, she said. 4 days, Silas said. "Then it's done," she said, not triumphantly but with something that was both more and less than triumph, a quieter determination, the kind that does not require an audience. "Then it's done," he agreed. He stood beside her on the boardwalk, and the Wichita afternoon moved around them, and he looked at her profile and thought that 4 days was both entirely enough time and not nearly enough time, depending on what you were counting. The Widow Pierce's boarding house on Emporia Street was warm and clean, and occupied by 3 other women, 2 of them schoolteachers from the East who had come to take up positions in the new Sedgwick County School, and one of them, a young woman from Missouri who would not explain what had brought her to Wichita but who cooked exceptionally well and seemed to find comfort in doing so. Ada fit into this household immediately and without effort, because she was constitutionally capable of fitting into most situations, and because Mrs. Pierce was the kind of woman who made fitting easy. Silas took a room at a hotel 2 blocks away and came to Emporia Street each evening for the meals. Mrs. Pierce served in the common dining room, and he and Ada sat across from each other at the table and talked, and the schoolteachers observed this with interest, and the woman from Missouri observed it with the wistful expression of someone who would have liked a similar situation for herself. On Friday evening, after supper, Silas and Ada walked along the Arkansas River in the lingering light of the spring evening, the river brown and wide and moving with quiet purpose. The cottonwood trees along the bank were leafing out, that pale yellow-green of early spring that is almost the color of light itself. "I'm not frightened of Monday," Ada said. "I was when I first understood what Payne intended, but I'm not any more." "You shouldn't be," Silas said. "It's strange," she said. "A week ago I was washing linens in Caldwell, and the most complicated thing in my day was reconciling Mrs. Calloway's ledger. Now I have a lawyer and a hearing date, and I've faced down a man who thought he owned me." She shook her head slightly. "Life moves oddly. You moved it, he said. Not oddly, exactly right. She glanced at him. You moved with it, she said. You didn't have to. He stopped walking, and she stopped with him, and they stood on the riverbank in the evening light, and he turned to face her with the expression of a man who has been careful about something for too long and has decided to stop being quite so careful about it. Ada, he said, I need to say something, and I want to say it before Monday because I don't want whatever is going to happen on Monday to be the first time I've said it. She looked at him steadily, her cream-colored eyes very direct. I'm not a man who speaks quickly, he said. I've never had the habit of it, but I have been in your company for 10 days and I am more certain of how I feel than I have been about most things I've spent years thinking about, so I'd like to say it plainly. He paused. I'm falling in love with you, or possibly I already have, and the falling is simply the name for what happened before I noticed. The river moved beside them and the cottonwood leaves turned in the small wind, and Ada looked at him for a long moment with the particular expression she wore when she was being truly honest with herself, which was the most careful and the most open expression she had. Silas, she said, I have been telling myself since the second day that what I was feeling was gratitude. Is it? He said. No, she said quietly. It isn't. It's something considerably more than that and considerably more inconvenient. Because you don't know what comes after Monday, he said. Because I have never made room for something like this in my life, she said. And I don't know how. Nor do I, he said honestly. But I'm not interested in walking away from it to avoid the difficulty of learning. She looked at him, and then she did something that she had not anticipated doing, something that surprised her own composure considerably. She reached out and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stood on the bank of the Arkansas River in the Wichita evening holding hands like two people who have just agreed to something they cannot yet fully articulate but which is already, in all the ways that matter, decided. They walked back along the river in the gathering dark, and he walked her to the door of Mrs. Pierce's boarding house and released her hand at the gate, and she went inside, and he walked back to his hotel 2 blocks away with the particular internal quality of a man for whom the world has recently reorganized itself into a better arrangement. Monday morning came clear and cool, with the kind of sky over Kansas that looks painted, too blue and too clean to be entirely real. Ada wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, and she put her hair up properly and pinned it, and she looked in the small mirror above the washstand in her room and said to herself, very quietly, You are a free woman and you are going to a court of law to prove it, and then she went downstairs. Silas was waiting outside the gate. He had shaved and he was wearing his better coat and he had brushed his hat, and when he saw her he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the past several days with increasing openness, the look that made her feel seen in the clearest possible sense. Ready? He said. Ready, she said. They walked to Aldgate's office together, and from there to the courthouse 3 blocks east, and the hearing room was small and smelled of wood oil and old paper, and the particular institutional seriousness of a place where real decisions are made. Judge Foster was already there, a compact man in his 60s with a white beard and the eyes of someone who has spent decades distinguishing between what people say and what they mean. He presided with an economy of manner that Ada immediately respected. Cutter Payne was there as well, with a lawyer of his own, a man from Ford County named Sutter who wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who has won more cases than he has lost. He looked at Ada when she entered and then at Silas, and his expression registered calculation and then settled back to professional neutrality. The hearing was not long, which was itself a kind of justice. Aldgate presented the argument with clean precision, citing the 13th Amendment and its application to private instruments like wills, and presenting the language of the document itself as evidence of its own indefensibility. He asked the court to invalidate the specific provision and to enter a ruling that the provision created no legal obligation on Ada's part. Silas testified to the document's contents and to the circumstances of its delivery, and his testimony was clear and steady and entirely credible, the testimony of someone who has nothing to manage or conceal. Sutter argued that the will was a valid legal instrument filed properly with the county clerk, that the court should respect the expressed wishes of a deceased property owner, and that Miss Finley's challenge was an attempt to evade a legitimate contractual arrangement. Ada, sitting at Aldgate's table, listened to this argument and found it almost remarkable in its audacity, the brazen framing of her existence as a contractual arrangement. She kept her expression still, and her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed slowly. Judge Foster listened to both sides without visible reaction, and then he asked 2 questions of clarification, and then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds in a silence that was the most important silence Ada had ever sat in. He said, "The provision in question, which purports to bind a living person to labor in satisfaction of the decedent's debt, is constitutionally void under the 13th Amendment's prohibition of involuntary servitude. The amendment makes no exception for the expressed wishes of deceased relatives. A will is a legal instrument, but it cannot override constitutional guarantees. The provision is hereby declared unenforceable and void. Miss Finley has no obligation arising from this document. The county filing shall be annotated accordingly." He said several other things regarding the mechanics of the ruling and its implementation, and he said something pointed to Sutter about the standards he expected from attorneys who practiced in his court, and then he adjourned the proceeding. Ada sat for a moment after the room began to move around her. She sat very still, and the ruling settled over her like water, like something she needed to absorb slowly so that she understood it properly in every layer. Silas was beside her. He did not say anything. He waited. She turned and looked at him, and she was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in this courthouse in front of Cutter Payne and his expensive lawyer, but her eyes were very bright and her jaw was tight with the effort of it. "We should go outside," he said quietly. She stood. She walked out of the courthouse with her back straight and her head up, and she did not look at Cutter Payne, who stood near the door with his hat in his hand, and an expression of a man who has received a setback and is already calculating the next move, but who understands that this particular game is over. Outside in the clear blue Kansas morning, Ada stopped on the courthouse steps and breathed in, and the air tasted like spring and freedom and the particular sweetness of a thing that has been fought for and won. Silas came to stand beside her. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. And then she turned and put her arms around him, and it was not a delicate or hesitant gesture. It was wholehearted and certain, and he put his arms around her in return, and they stood on the courthouse steps in Wichita, Kansas in the spring of 1882, and held each other in the clean morning light. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him. "You need to go to Topeka in June," she said. He laughed a real laugh surprised out of him, and she thought it was a very good sound. "Yes," he said, "I do. And after Topeka," she said, and there was a question in it that was not about geography. He looked at her with the full warmth of someone who has stopped being careful. "After Topeka," he said, "I'd like to come back to wherever you are if you'll have me." She held his gaze. "I'll have you," she said simply. They stood in the Wichita morning with that between them, solid and real, and the world continued its business around them, and they did not particularly notice. They stayed in Wichita one more day, during which Aldgate filed the necessary paperwork to ensure the ruling was properly recorded in both Sedgwick County and Ford County, and Silas wrote to Barton and Webb in Dodge City, explaining that he would not be returning to his position there, which was a letter he wrote with the particular lightness of a man who has just put down something heavy he had been carrying for longer than he realized. He and Ada had supper at a proper restaurant on Douglas Avenue, the kind with a tablecloth and a card menu, and they ate beef and potatoes and pie, and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with wills or courts or Cutter Payne. about books they had read and places they wanted to see, and the particular merits and deficiencies of various Kansas towns, and about families and what they had been, and what you made of yourself when what you came from was insufficient. My mother was the best person I knew, Ada said, over the pie. She was also the most tired person I knew. She gave everything to my father and to me, and there was nothing left for herself. I used to watch her and think, I will not do that. I will not give myself away until there is nothing left. And now, Silas said, and now, Ada said carefully, I think what I was actually telling myself was, I will not let someone take from me, which is a different thing from giving. He looked at her. Yes, he said, it is. Giving is a choice, she said. What my father tried to do was not. No, he said, it was not. She looked at him across the tablecloth. What I feel for you is a choice, she said. I want you to know that. The candlelight between them made the moment look like something in a painting, warm and clear and permanent. Silas Fairchild, who was not a man given to impulsive actions, reached across the table and took her hand and said, Then I am grateful for it every day. They rode back toward Caldwell the next morning, and the journey was different from the one that had brought them north, lighter and more expansive, as though the road itself had been altered by the hearing. They talked more easily, laughed more often, and once, when Ada's horse spooked at a prairie dog and she managed the animal with casual expertise, Silas watched her with an expression she caught and which made her shake her head at him. Stop looking at me like that, she said. Like what? He said. Like I did something impressive. It was a prairie dog. You handled it well, he said, the picture of innocence. I've been riding since I was 7 years old, she said. I know, he said. I'm still allowed to appreciate it. She looked at him sideways and tried to suppress the smile and was not entirely successful, which he noted with satisfaction. When they reached Caldwell on the third day, Mrs. Calloway came out onto the porch of the boarding house and looked at both of them and said, Well. And Ada said, The judge ruled in my favor. And Mrs. Calloway put her hand over her heart and said, Thank God and common sense, in that order. She fed them both an enormous meal and asked approximately 40 questions about the hearing, and about Wichita, and about Perry Aldgate. And she also asked about Silas's plans in a way that was transparent enough that Ada excused herself to bring more coffee largely, so she would not have to participate in it. Silas answered Mrs. Calloway's questions with the patience of someone who understands that a woman who has fed you repeatedly has earned the right to know your intentions. He stayed in Caldwell through May, and in that time the atmosphere between him and Ada changed in increments that were individually small and collectively enormous. He was no longer a stranger she had trusted with an important thing. He was a person who was woven into the ordinary fabric of her days, who appeared at the boarding house each morning, and whose voice she knew in the next room, whose opinions she argued with, and whose company she preferred to nearly everyone else's. He helped her find a larger room to rent in a house on 2nd Street, since Mrs. Calloway had a full occupancy waiting, and he spent a Saturday afternoon helping her carry her small trunk and her box of books up the stairs. The books took 2 trips and he read the spines as he carried them, commenting on them, and she talked back over her shoulder from the stairs, and Mrs. Hartley's copy of Blackstone was in there, she confessed, which she had never returned, and Silas said that Mrs. Hartley would probably consider it adequate payment for everything she had provided, and Ada laughed and said she hoped so. In late May, Silas received word that his application to sit the bar examination in Topeka had been accepted. He told Ada at supper, and she set down her fork and looked at him with the full, direct happiness of someone who feels another person's good news as their own. When, she said, June the 7th, he said, I'll need to leave by the end of the month to give myself time to review. Then we should start reviewing now, she said. You should study out loud, she said firmly. I'll ask you the questions, it's more effective. He looked at her with fond exasperation that was quickly becoming one of his most practiced expressions. Ada, you don't know the bar examination questions. No, she said, but you do, and when you explain them to me, you'll understand them better yourself. That's how it works. I read it in a book." He did not ask which book, partly because it didn't matter and partly because she was right. So they spent the evenings of the last weeks of May in the parlor of the house on 2nd Street, with his notes spread on the table between them. And Ada asked him questions, and pushed back when his answers were unclear, and made him explain again in plain language, when the legal terminology was doing the work that reasoning should be doing. And he discovered that she was an extraordinarily effective study partner, and an even more effective mirror for the places where his thinking was loose. "You're going to pass," she told him on the last evening before he left. "You've said that before," he said. "I'll say it again," she said. "You're going to pass." He was standing near the door with his hat in his hand, and the lamp behind her made a warm light in the room, and she was looking at him with the complete directness that he had come to understand as her most honest mode, no performance in it, no management. He crossed the room and kissed her, the first time he had done it, and it was not impulsive. It was the most deliberately considered thing he had done in a long time, and she kissed him back with the same certainty, both hands holding the front of his coat, and when they stepped back from each other the room seemed to have changed slightly in quality, the air different, the light different, everything slightly more vivid. "Come back," she said. "I will," he said, and the conviction in his voice was total. He rode to Topeka, and he sat the bar examination on June the 7th and 8th, 2 days of written and oral examination before a panel of 3 lawyers who asked him questions with the specific intention of finding the places where his knowledge failed. He answered them carefully and completely, and went back to his rented room each evening and ate supper alone and thought about Ada, and about the house on 2nd Street, and about the way she had said come back as though it were a complete instruction and required nothing added to it. He received the result in the 2nd week of June. He had passed. He was, as of that date, a licensed attorney in the state of Kansas. He rode back to Caldwell in 3 days and arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and Ada was in the kitchen garden again, same as the day he had come back to stand beside her on the porch against Payne, and she looked up and saw him and went still for a moment. He had not telegraphed ahead because he had wanted to tell her himself. He saw the question in her face before she asked it. "I passed," he said. She put down the trowel she was holding and stood up and crossed the garden to him and put both arms around him again, as she had on the courthouse steps in Wichita, wholehearted and without reservation. "I knew you would," she said into his shoulder. "You always say that," he said. "I'm always right," she said. He laughed and held her, and the Kansas afternoon was warm and full of birdsong and the smell of turned earth and growing things. He stayed that evening for supper and told Mrs. Calloway, who applauded with genuine enthusiasm, and the woman from Missouri who had followed Ada from Mrs. Pierce's household to Caldwell, whose name turned out to be Ruth, clapped from the kitchen doorway and said she had known he would do it from the moment she saw them come back from Wichita. "You could see it," Ruth said, nodding as though this were a complete explanation. "See what?" Silas asked. "That you'd already decided," Ruth said simply, and went back to the kitchen. Silas and Ada sat on the porch of the boarding house after supper in the long summer evening, and the fireflies were beginning their business in the grass, and the smell of the season was grass and warm dust, and the subtle sweetness of the honeysuckle someone had planted years ago along the boarding house fence. "What do you do now?" Ada asked. "With the license." "I need to set up a practice," he said. "I've been thinking about that. Caldwell is growing. There are cattle operations here that need legal representation, and there are ordinary people with ordinary legal problems who can't afford the lawyers in Dodge City." He paused. "I've been thinking about Caldwell specifically." She looked at him. "You're here," he said with characteristic directness. "That is not the only reason, but it is a significant one." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Silas, ask me something." He looked at her in the firefly-lit evening, this woman who had faced a man who thought he owned her and had stood straight and clear-voiced and unfrightened, who had read Blackstone's commentaries on loan from a traveling merchant, who had told him to burn a document and watched it go to ash with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. "Ada Finley," he said, "Would you marry me?" She turned and looked at him fully, with nothing held back in her expression, and said, "Yes. I would very much like that." They were married in October of 1882 at the small Methodist church on Kishom Street in Caldwell, on a morning when the Kansas sky was the deep clear blue of autumn and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold. Mrs. Calloway provided a breakfast reception afterward at the boarding house, and cooked for 2 days beforehand, and wept throughout the ceremony with what she maintained were tears of simple happiness, and which everyone recognized as tears of proprietary satisfaction. Perry Aldgate wrote from Wichita to offer his congratulations. Ruth made the wedding cake. 2 of the cattle buyers who regularly stayed at the boarding house attended as witnesses and brought a bottle of whiskey as a gift, which Silas accepted graciously, and Ada set on a high shelf for medicinal purposes. Ada Finley became Ada Fairchild, and she kept both names in her own mind because Finley was the name she had built herself with, and she was not willing to let it go entirely. Silas opened his law office on the 1st of November in a 2-room space on the main street of Caldwell, between the hardware store and the surveyor's office, and he painted his name on the window in gold letters that Ada helped him choose the size for. He took his first case 2 days after opening, a dispute between a farmer and a cattle driver over a broken fence line, which he resolved in 3 hours, and for which he was paid $3 and a smoked ham. "That's a good start," Ada said when he came home with the ham. "It's a start," he said. $3 and a ham is a fine start," she said firmly, and put the ham on the kitchen table and started planning what to cook. Their house was on the quieter eastern side of Caldwell, a wood-frame house with a proper parlor and a kitchen and 2 upstairs rooms, and a small yard where Ada immediately began planning a garden more ambitious than the one behind the boarding house. Silas built her a raised bed in the first week of December, working in the thin winter sunshine with lumber from the hardware store next to his office, and she stood in the yard and directed him with an authority he found simultaneously unreasonable and entirely welcome. By the spring of 1883, Silas's practice had grown beyond what he had anticipated. The cattle industry generated an enormous volume of legal work, contracts and disputes and land claims, and the endless complications of large operations moving through legally complicated terrain. And Silas was discovering that his thorough, careful, plain-spoken approach was exactly what most of his clients needed and had never found in the lawyers from the larger towns. He also took cases that did not pay well, the cases of homesteaders and small farmers whose legal difficulties were real and whose resources were not, and he argued these with the same thoroughness he brought to the cattle company contracts, and his reputation in the county for fairness grew alongside his reputation for competence. Ada had, in this same period, set herself up as a bookkeeper. It had begun with helping Silas keep his office accounts, which she did with the same meticulous competence she had brought to Mrs. Calloway's ledger, and then a merchant on the main street had asked if she could do his accounts as well, and then a second merchant, and then the hotel, and by midsummer of 1883 she had a regular schedule of bookkeeping clients and was earning a consistent income that she managed with complete independence and considerable satisfaction. "You could stop if you wanted," Silas said one evening, not meaning it as a criticism but checking in. "Why would I want to?" She said, looking up from her ledger. "No reason at all," he said. "I was just noting the option." "I like the work," she said. "I'm good at it, and we're saving money faster this way, which means we can expand the office sooner." He looked at her across the parlor table with the helpless warmth that had been his primary mode with her since approximately their second day together. "I love you," he said. She looked up again, this time with the soft and somewhat unguarded expression she still occasionally seemed surprised to find on her own face. "I love you," she said back, and went back to the ledger. In late autumn of 1883, Ada told Silas she was expecting a child. she told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning while he was drinking his coffee and reviewing a contract, and he set both down and looked at her, and then stood up and crossed the kitchen to her in 2 strides and held her face in his hands and said, "Are you well?" "I'm fine," she said. "I've been fine for 3 months. I was waiting until I was certain." 3 months, he said, not with reproach but with the particular slightly stricken expression of a man recalculating a large amount of time. "You've known for 3 months. I wanted to be sure," she said. "I didn't want to get your hopes up and then have them come to nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Ada," he said, "I would rather know, whatever happens." She looked back at him and nodded once. "All right," she said. "I'll remember that." He held her carefully in the kitchen with the October light coming through the window, and she put her arms around him and they stood there while the coffee went cold and the contract sat unreviewed on the table and neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a morning as clear as the morning they had married, and he arrived with a great deal of opinion about the process and very little patience for the time it was taking. He was healthy and loud, and he had Ada's eyes and Silas's jaw, and from the moment he appeared in the world Silas looked at him with an expression of such complete and somewhat bewildered love that it made Ada laugh even in her exhaustion. They named him Thomas, for no one in particular and for both of them in some general sense, and he was Thomas Finley Fairchild, the Finley in the middle placed there deliberately by Ada because she wanted something of her own name carried forward, and because Silas had not only agreed immediately but had suggested it before she could ask. Thomas was an extremely opinionated baby who grew into an extremely opinionated toddler, and he had Silas's methodical quality paired with Ada's directness, which produced a child who would ask the same question with patient persistence until he received an answer that actually satisfied him. Ada found this delightful. Silas found this delightful and also occasionally exhausting, which he mentioned, and which Ada told him was the universe providing him with a practical education in how conversations with her felt from the outside. He conceded this point. Caldwell grew and changed around them through the mid-1880s. The cattle trade that had defined the town began its slow decline as the ranges were fenced, and the long drives became less economical, but Silas's practice diversified with the town's changing economy, taking in more homestead cases and merchant disputes, and the legal work of an agricultural community settling into permanence. He hired a young clerk in 1885, a nervous young man from Ohio named Garrett who reminded Silas somewhat of himself at that age, and he taught Garrett with the same patience and thoroughness that had characterized his own education. Ada expanded her bookkeeping practice in the same period, and in 1886 she proposed, with the characteristic directness that still occasionally caught people unprepared, that she open a small bookkeeping and accounting office of her own rather than working from her kitchen table. Silas thought about it for approximately half a day and then said yes, and they found her a small room in a building 2 blocks from his office, and she put her own sign up with her own name, Ada Fairchild Accounting Services. She was by this point one of the better-known figures in Caldwell's business community, known for her precision and her discretion, and for the frank manner with which she informed clients when their accounts did not balance and why. She was respected in a way that had nothing to do with her husband, which was exactly the way she had always wanted it. The matter of Cutter Payne resolved itself without further drama, which was satisfying in its thoroughness. Payne's cattle operation ran into financial difficulties of its own in 1884, the result of a drought year and overextended credit, and he sold most of his holdings and relocated to Colorado. Ada heard this from a merchant passing through who had known Payne in Ford County, and she received the information with equanimity. Payne had been a serious threat, and she did not minimize what he had intended, but he was also now a finished chapter, and she had more interesting things to occupy her attention. She was pregnant again by the summer of 1886, and she told Silas in June, this time within a week of being certain, and he received the news with the same focused and somewhat overwhelmed joy he had shown the first time, which she appreciated because it was genuine. This pregnancy was somewhat harder than the first, the summer heat making the early months uncomfortable, but she continued her accounting work until September and went back in January, and Silas did not suggest she stop, because he understood that the work was not merely income for her but a piece of herself. Their daughter was born in February of 1887, small and pink and furiously awake, with dark hair like her mother and Silas's watchful, quiet manner, already apparent in the way she observed the world with large eyes that missed very little. They named her Clara, and Thomas, who was nearly 3, received her with the seriousness of someone given an important assignment, and spent considerable time standing near her with the air of a person on guard duty. The winter of 1887 was cold but not brutal, and the house on the eastern side of Caldwell, which they had expanded with a proper addition the previous year, was warm and full of the particular noise that a house with 2 small children and 2 working parents produces, the noise of things being managed and things being discussed, and things being knocked over and set upright again. Silas came home late one evening in March, after a long day in court in the county seat, and found Ada at the parlor table with Clara asleep in the crocheted basket beside her and Thomas asleep upstairs and a candle burning and her ledgers spread around her, and she looked up when he came in with an expression of someone who has been waiting for the day to be finished. He sat down across from her and said, "How was today?" "Good," she said. "Productive. I reconciled the hotel accounts and found an error in the Mercer books that's going to save them $60. She paused. "How was court?" "I won," he said, which was not the point of the question but was the answer she had been hoping for. "The Hartley family keeps their land." She smiled, the real one, the one that had no careful management in it at all. "Good," she said. They sat together at the parlor table in the candlelight with the accounts between them and the baby sleeping in her basket and the cold March wind finding the edges of the house, and it was so ordinary and so complete that it was almost impossible to hold the whole weight of it consciously, the distance from where they had each been to where they were now. "Silas," Ada said. He said, not looking up from the brief he had brought home. "Do you remember the first morning, in the boarding-house dining room?" He set the brief down and looked at her. "Yes," he said, "every detail." "You burned it in front of me," she said. "You didn't ask me what to do, you just read what it said and you acted." "You handed it to me," he said. "You asked me to." "I know," she said, "but you understood what it meant before I asked. That's what I've been thinking about." She looked at him steadily. "Most people would have been embarrassed on my behalf and looked away from it, or they would have tried to manage it for me without letting me be part of the decision. You just looked at it directly and then you looked at me." He was quiet for a moment, looking back at her in the candlelight. "I couldn't have done anything else," he said. "Not with you sitting across that table." "Why not?" He thought about how to say it accurately. "Because you were so clearly a person," he said. "And what was written on that page so clearly wasn't about a person at all. It was the most obvious thing I'd ever seen, the distance between what you were and what your father wrote. It seemed wrong to be anything other than direct about it." She held his gaze for a long moment, and the look between them was the same look that had been building since that dining room in Caldwell, the look that knew everything that mattered. "I'm glad you came to Caldwell," she said. "I'm glad I read the document before I delivered it," he said. She laughed softly, careful not to wake Clara. "We both had good timing." "We did," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had taken it on the riverbank in Wichita with the cottonwoods leafing out and the whole business still unresolved, and she turned her hand and held his, and outside the March wind moved through Caldwell and the candle held its ground. The years that followed were full in the way that a life lived deliberately and with good company is full, not without difficulty, because difficulty comes regardless, but with the kind of foundation under it that makes difficulty navigable. Silas's practice grew to encompass 2 clerks and a correspondence that stretched across 3 counties. Ada's accounting office became the most trusted in the region, and she was consulted by businesses in Wichita on occasion, making the journey on the train that had come to the area by 1886, and which she rode with Thomas when he was old enough, letting him look out the window at the rolling Kansas country and telling him what she knew of its history. Thomas grew into a boy with a particular gift for argument and a fundamental instinct for fairness that his parents recognized from their different angles. He was going to be a lawyer, Ada said when he was 7, watching him arbitrate a dispute between 2 neighborhood children with patient authority. Silas said he looked forward to it. Clara grew into a girl who was quieter than her brother and considerably more observant, who kept a journal from the age of 6, and who had strong opinions about nearly everything, but expressed them with a deliberateness that made people pay attention. She was interested in numbers with the same natural aptitude her mother had, and Ada began teaching her the principles of accounting when she was 8, and Clara absorbed them with the focused pleasure of someone who has found the right tool for how their mind works. In the spring of 1890, Ada and Silas sat on the porch of the expanded house on a Sunday evening, the children inside doing the reading they had been assigned, the Kansas evening settling into the long blue twilight of early spring. The cottonwoods along the creek were leafing out again in that pale, extraordinary green. The smell of the garden came to them on the small wind. 8 years since the morning in the boarding-house dining room. 8 years since Silas Fairchild had ridden into Caldwell with a sealed document in his saddlebag and a face that was careful and honest, and she had understood almost immediately, fundamentally trustworthy. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He had always asked her this because he had never assumed he knew. "That we are very lucky," she said. "We worked for it," he said. "Both things can be true," she said. He nodded and looked at the evening, and then he looked at her, this woman he had loved for 8 years and would love. He was entirely certain, for however many years followed. She was 31 now, and the years had added a certain quality to her face, the quality of someone who has done difficult things and come through them whole, and it was a face he would choose again from any in the world. "Thomas asked me yesterday what I do," Silas said. "He knows what you do," Ada said. "He asked why," Silas said. "Why I became a lawyer. He's 8 years old, and he asked why I chose it." Ada turned to look at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," Silas said. "That I grew up knowing that the law is the best tool most people have for making the world fair, and that I wanted to use it." He paused. "And that I met someone who made me stop postponing." Ada was quiet for a moment. "You told an 8-year-old that?" "He asked a serious question," Silas said. "He got a serious answer." Ada shook her head, smiling, and looked back at the evening. "What did he say?" "He said, 'That makes sense,' and went back to his book." She laughed, the full laugh that she gave easily now, easily and frequently, and he thought it was the sound he would always most want to hear. "Silas," she said after the laugh had settled, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "The morning I walked into that dining room and saw you standing there," she said, "I was frightened. Not of you. Of whatever you'd brought with you, the way you'd brought it, the look on your face that said it was serious. And I walked in anyway because there wasn't anything else to do." She looked at him. "But when you said you couldn't just ask me to sign the acknowledgement, not after you'd read it, that was when I stopped being frightened of the situation. That was when I knew that whatever was coming, I wasn't facing it alone." He looked at her steadily. "You were never going to be alone with it," he said. "Not from that moment." "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it then, but I felt it." She paused. "That's the thing about you, Silas. You tell the truth about everything, even the things that are uncomfortable. You told me what the document said when you could have let me discover it for myself. You told me about your fears about the bar examination. You told me you were falling in love with me before you had any certainty I felt the same way." She met his eyes. "You make honesty feel like a gift rather than a weapon." He sat with this for a moment. Outside, the first fireflies were appearing in the long grass at the edge of the yard, small intermittent lights in the gathering dark. "You taught me that," he said, "the way you meet everything directly. I watched you do it from the first day, and I've been trying to match it ever since." She looked at him with the full warmth she rarely performed and always felt, the warmth of someone who has found the exact right place in the world and knows it. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cold." They went inside together, into the warm house, into the voices of their children over books, into the lamplight and the smell of the supper Ruth had left earlier in the day, and the particular rich, ordinary texture of a life that had been built deliberately and with love. Thomas looked up when they came in and said, "Father, I have a question about contracts," with the focused purpose of someone for whom the boundary between dinner time and working hours had never seemed particularly important. "Tomorrow," Silas said. "But it's important," Thomas said. "Everything is important tomorrow," Ada said, and kissed the top of his head, and he submitted to this with the resigned dignity of an 8-year-old who knows he has lost but maintains his position regardless. Clara was reading with the concentrated stillness she brought to all reading, her journal open beside her with fresh entries in the careful script she had developed, and she looked up at Ada with the observing expression that always reminded Ada of Silas in certain lights. "Mama," Clara said. "Yes. Are you happy?" Ada looked at her daughter, this small, deliberate person who kept her own counsel and asked her questions at the exact right moment. And then she looked at Silas across the room, and he was looking back at her with the brown and amber eyes that had been the first thing she had really seen about him in the boarding house parlor, all those years ago. "Yes," Ada said simply. "I am." Clara nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went back to her book. Silas set his coat on the hook by the door and came into the room and sat in his chair by the fire and picked up the brief he had brought home, and Ada sat across from him with her ledger. And outside the Kansas night came fully down over Caldwell, and in the long window of the parlor the fireflies were out in earnest now, the first real warmth of spring making its case against the remnant cold of the season passing. It was very quiet and very warm and very full, the way a room is full when everything in it that matters is present, and the story that had begun in a boarding house dining room with a sealed document and a fire had arrived at this, which was exactly and entirely where it was meant to be. Silas looked up from his brief and caught Ada's eye, and she raised an eyebrow at him in the way she had, the way that meant "what is it?" And he shook his head slightly, meaning nothing, "just you, just this." And she held his gaze for a moment with the steady, complete attention that had never once faltered in 8 years, and then she looked back at her ledger. And the fire burned, and the children read, and the night settled over Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1890, and outside the window the cottonwoods turned their silver leaves in the small wind off the plains, and everything was, at last and without qualification, well.